We're going to get started here right at 1 o'clock.
In the meantime, there's an icebreaker there to get used to the idea of putting some suggestions in or some questions or comments to help us along here.
So let's go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you, George. First, I want to welcome Geoff, someone who is going to offer us a very unique perspective today, and it's great to have him here. Thanks, Geoff, for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Geoff.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we wanted to ask you, and again, please use the chat box, is tell us your expectations for today's town hall meeting. What do you want to learn today, and how can we help? I'm George Kakan. I'm the regional director for the Southeast Michigan office for Wightman, and I'm going to be your facilitator today. Welcome everybody to Wednesdays with Wightman Town Hall meeting. We decided to provide this platform for superintendents to learn, become informed, ask questions, and share best practices during this time of the COVID-19 shutdown. I know that many of you are facing challenges and are dealing with issues that you've never had to deal with before. And we thought that using this platform could bring superintendents together to share their ideas and then be able to take those back to their communities to implement them and help them as they move through this COVID-19 period. The 3 phases of COVID-19 were developed by Heidi Jacobs, and she's worked with several other colleagues of hers. And we thought that this would be a good platform on which to organize our town hall meeting. The first phase, which we're almost done with, is that triage phase, when we're faced with the realization that, you know, oh my, we have to do something. You know, the kids aren't going to school. How are they going to receive education? And we try to prioritize all those things. And now we're slowly moving into the transition phase where things are starting to open up again, and we need to plan and transition from students being at home and coming back to school. And what does that look like? And what is that time frame? And what are the things that we need to plan for in order for that to happen and to happen safely? And then finally, the post-pandemic phase, which is the phase in which we've gone through the first two, but this is where there may be a real opportunity to be able to redefine or reshape how we educate our students and how we actually operate as a school district and as a business, you know, moving forward after we have the opportunity to put this behind us. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tom Langdon. He's a superintendent and mentor at Walkerville Public Schools, and he's also an educational consultant for Wightman. And he helps with our professionals to develop excellent learning environments for students here in Michigan. So thank you. Tom?
Thanks, George. Sorry about getting there a little too quick. I'm real excited about this program, and I think it's going to be, yeah, it's going to be a great one. I really do appreciate the information, George, as you shared it. It's spot on about what we're trying to get done today. But without any further ado, time spent, I want to introduce Geoff Smith here and just thank him for coming in. Welcome, Geoff.
Thanks, Tom.
So I first got to know you when I was a superintendent at Sturgis Public Schools.
Yeah, I was a detective sergeant then when I was on the Sturgis Board of Education. And then over the years, transitioned up to Director of Public Safety for the City of Sturgis. Stayed on the Sturgis Board for about 11 years. And then shortly before you left, around that time, I moved over to the St. Joseph County ISD Board.
So obviously that board experience hasn't hurt you at all as far as your perspective as you work as a public safety director, correct?
Yeah, I think it helps a little bit. You know, schools are different in a lot of aspects than public safety, but both are technically government and, you know, controlled by budgets and things like that that are a lot of times out of our control. So just different nuances and different things that make those little bits of difference and helps to expand knowledge and how schools operate, and also to help with the relationship between whether it's the city or public safety and the schools. And at the beginning of my career, I was a school resource officer, different title back then, but did that for about 7 years too.
Right. So obviously all of those things are going to be really important as far as how you view this situation and how schools should respond to this situation as well. And to throw all that in with the fact that you are also someone who actually got COVID-19 and has since recovered.
I did. Kind of a crazy story on that one, but not unexpected, but yeah. I know a few of the questions that we wanted to talk about, and I also know that we wanted to, if there are questions, and I know George talked about it a little bit earlier, was that if there were any specific questions, I'd try to answer them best that I can. I know that one of the big things that's coming up is obviously with, well, there's a couple that have suddenly developed. One obviously is budgets for schools. The other one is graduations for seniors and things like that. So one of the questions that is often asked from a public safety perspective is, what is it that, you know, can happen as far as graduation, that type of thing? You know, there's not really a singular answer. The best suggestion, and one of the questions I know that Tom wanted to ask me out of the gate.
Geoff, I'm back on now, Geoff. So sorry about that. It's one of those beauties of modern technology situations. So, but yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. Graduation is one of the huge things that we have to talk about today. So, not to interrupt you again, but go right ahead.
Well, I was just going to say is one of the things that is probably the number one issue that everyone is dealing with, whether that's in my profession with public safety or, you know, as a board member in the schools with superintendents and the boards and everybody else, is with budgeting and how are we providing education to the students? What does that look like? Well, we have to live in today with whatever the executive order from the governor and the guidelines from the feds are today. But at the same time, we have to try to think of the future. So the one thing that we've learned over the years, and granted, this pandemic is unlike anything any of us have ever experienced, probably nothing or something that we would have ever thought to experience. But incidents like Columbine, incidents like 9/11, we've pre-planned for natural disasters, things like that. What we need to be doing is planning. And I know that almost everyone is, but it's the expansion of those plans. And it's trying to predict what is going to happen. Just like I know a lot of superintendents frantically right now are trying to predict what's going to happen with their budget for this year, which is a couple months long, or left, I should say. And then for next year with the budget deficit that they're talking about.
Right.
And so trying to plan all that when you don't know is tough. Well, if you think about in the same aspect as this pandemic, you need to think of all the different scenarios. So as you're planning out, you need to not just have one plan, you need to have different plans in place. And they may not be specific. They may not be the all-encompassing that, hey, this happened, here's what we're rolling out. But they could at least be good starts, and they could have all of these different subcategories. Maybe if this happens, this is the direction we're going to try to go. And as I said, that's not always easy. But if you make sure that you're communicating really well with other superintendents, maybe it's you know, your state associations, maybe it's neighboring jurisdictions, other ISDs, other, you know, similar sized school districts, things like that. Maybe you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Maybe they have a really good idea for some of your problems that you can kind of basically go back and forth with each other and try to tailor that so that as you're going through those plans, you can try to develop something. Because just yesterday, you know, the governor was talking about, she got asked a question very specifically about K-12 education. And of course, there are no specific answers yet, but, you know, she did mention that there's all of these different chances for the fall, ranging from we could be right back to full the way we were to the fact that there may be a reduction of how many students, to the fact that if there's another spike, we could be where we are today. So there's all those things to try to figure out. And it's not easy, especially when you're trying to come up with your budget. It's also impossible cuts.
Right. So if at this point, we're talking about long range issues, short range issues. The other day when we were talking about this show, you mentioned a situation where you made a decision and the schools followed along with you. And it was just about the fact that students were playing basketball together, which obviously does not follow the 6-foot rule at all. And you made a quick decision that was also, I think, kind of elegant in its simplicity. Just remind me what you did there to take care of that issue.
Well, yeah, so it was the city's decision along with the schools. What had happened was, although, we're encouraging outdoor activities and everything else, about 3 to 4 weeks ago, we were having semi-large groups of mostly teenagers up through early 20s gathering at our parks and things like that and playing basketball, et cetera. And we had a lot of people concerned that, not that we were encouraging them to violate social distancing and that type of thing, but here were these, I'll call them hot spots, that there was that activity, and it was really hard to discourage. So the city decided to take down the basketball rims from the parks, and then in conversations with our local school district, they did the same thing with any of their outside equipment that they had, basketball rims and things like that, to try to discourage it.
So simple as that. And we about 3 weeks ago, I meet weekly with our ESD superintendents. We went round and round about this. And do we disinfect? Do we put signs up? Do we say kids can't use the basketball courts? Well, what you decided was very simplistic, but it was also very powerful. We're not having basketball right now. And of course, then you send the other messages you mentioned that, we do want you to be physically active, but do it in the right way, because this is not the right way. And you need to help find yourselves the way to do that in a way that's safe and it conforms to some of the rules we're under right now. So as we move on in this whole conversation, I know a lot of people are intrigued with the fact that, again, you contracted the COVID-19, and it may have been due to some business travel, a conference you went to, but could you just explain in a sequential way how you felt that you had it and what happened as far as taking care of yourself and making sure your family was taken care of, and then actually a couple of your family members actually did contract it too, or at least you suspect that. So can you go through that for us, please? Sure,
I'll try to make it short. It's a long story, but I'm not sure where I contracted it from, other than I did have I don't want to call it really a conference, but there's a small group of chiefs, litigators, and some professionals from Michigan Municipal League. And twice a year we get together and we develop best practices, policies that can be shared with other agencies and things like that on hot topic items. So we had one of those up in the northern region of Michigan. Whether I picked it up traveling to or from, I'm not real sure. Basically, I woke up on Monday morning very early that day, had a busy day. I just didn't feel right. Wasn't sure what's wrong. Took my temperature, had 102 point something fever, and kind of had that oh crap moment. And because I normally don't really get a fever. So I called my primary care physician, who wanted me to call the health department also. That was on March 16th. So back then, they were still dealing with a lot of key questions, like if you traveled internationally, et cetera. So I went and got tested for flu, strep. Still at this point in the morning, I just thought it was something else. Those came back negative. They ran me through whatever their checklist was at the time, and those are ever changing as well as to who gets tested. They made some kind of decision to test me. I got tested. I'm going to throw that off to the side for now. At that time, it took 14 days for me to get my test results back. But by the end of that day, I knew, let me put it this way. I was hoping that's what I had, because I was sick, and I was really sick. So I really won't get into the symptoms right now. If we have time and people want to know, I'll go through all those with everybody. For me, it lasted about 72 hours, 48 of which, like I said, it was bad enough that I was hoping that that's what it was, because if it wasn't, I was going to be really, really scared of what COVID would do to me.
Right.
I followed all the CDC guidelines, came home, basically self-isolation in the house to my bedroom, which has a bathroom. My wife and kids that are here, my oldest was in college and living in Kalamazoo, were nice enough to bring me stuff to the door if I needed it. But basically with the symptoms, I kind of just want to be left alone other than getting some water. But then on day 3, my wife ended up getting sick, and same symptoms pretty much. The big difference for her is hers ended up lasting almost 2 weeks.
Wow.
And then sometime during that first week, two of my daughters ended up waking up one morning with either like a low-grade fever. You know, the whole reminded me of if there was school going on. It'd been like, yeah, Dad, I don't feel real good. And you look at them and you can tell, yeah, you don't. Take their temp. Yeah, okay, you're staying home. More like that. And for them, it basically lasted about 24 hours, maybe just a little bit more. And then my third daughter, who's still in the house, she ended up getting it about the following day that same week. Pretty much same thing. It was more like you're a sick kid. I got better fairly quickly. It pretty much went away. A few lingering symptoms maybe for a week and a half, but like I said, the first 3 days was bad, and then it kind of just went away like everything else. But my wife, she had it for 2 weeks. She had to go to the hospital, I think twice, if I remember correctly, basically for dehydration and some things like that went along with it. Fortunately, none of the severe respiratory problems that would take either oxygen or being intubated.
Right.
So,
Well, and you have a lot to share, so maybe we will wait for that last 15 minutes from 1:45.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, for that, or if someone actually wants to. And I want to remind everyone that please ask questions on the chat bar. We'd love to answer those questions, have Geoff answer those questions so that you're better informed on this. I mean, we have this unique opportunity. Everybody's facing unique issues, so we will definitely be watching the chat bar. But for right now, we're looking at next year, and we're hearing things like schools may be to like a 13-to-1 ratio in classes to be able to keep that distancing, one-way traffic in hallways, just stuff that you never would have considered, you know, unless it was out of Orwell, you wouldn't even consider some of these things. But now we're in, you know, hip deep into it. There's going to be some construction issues that are going to have to come up and some design issues. But a lot of this can also be just done by the superintendent and leadership by looking around and seeing where the areas are going to show weaknesses as far as student contact. Just a whole lot of things. I think we have to rely on experts, but also ourselves. Is that how you see it in the situation as a past board member of an LEA and also a current ESD board member?
Yeah, you know, my opinion would just be back to, you know, if I tie schools in with my professional job of being director of public safety, you know, I mentioned in the pre-conversation a little bit with George, we were talking about, you know, supplies and things like that. You know, we tried to get a lot of our PPE, so our personal protective equipment and things like that. When all of this sort of started, we tried to stock up a little bit ahead of time, and that was a little bit of foresight on our part. Not because we didn't think that either FEMA or emergency management from the state or the feds would come through. It's just trying to prepare a little bit on our own. And outside of that, we also worked with our local agencies in our county and surrounding areas to try to help each other out. So maybe we had an excess of something that they needed and vice versa. And then obviously the community stepped up in a lot of ways, and a lot of plants, industrial plants, just citizens that had things that might be needed were sharing with, whether it was the hospital or doctor's offices and that type of thing. My opinion, back to your question succinctly, is just that I think that a lot of times, I don't want to say go at it alone, but you need to not always rely on those other people, but you need to look at those groups of friends, colleagues, and people that are in your profession and start tying in those groups and having those communications back and forth. And, you know, then if you get that help from the state or you get that help from the feds, you're sitting in a better position. but you're not waiting on them basically to try to move forward.
Right. And also, I think that we have to reach out to people like specialists in the industries to be able to help answer some of our questions. But if we can come to them with some specific questions about areas that we see weaknesses possibly being in our schools, I think that might narrow the focus a little bit and be able to get things done more precipitously. And that, I guess that's partly my opinion on that, but I just know when you hear about these things, again, with a 12-to-1 ratio, 13-to-1 ratio, and hallways going one way, wow, it's going to have to take some engineering, I think, personally on that. So as we look forward again, we're talking about triage, we're talking about then transforming and looking towards the post-pandemic. We heard some news this week that post-pandemic, it might take a little longer than we thought. We were all kind of hoping that we would get that vaccine in. So, I think that what you said earlier about planning is very true. And we have to plan maybe for just not fall. I think if you were to ask all the superintendents in the state, it'd be interesting if we did a little straw poll with a comment section here. But I would say that the majority might say that they're very, very nervous about starting in the fall. So as we plan, we have to wait for the next EO to come out. But we also, I think, have to consider the fact, and I would like your opinion, on maybe we look at 1 year out, 2 year out, 3 year out type of a thing.
Sure. And I stressed, and I was pretty heavy on my comments with the planning, but I left a couple of key terms of those plans out, and, continuity of operations, continuity of learning. Those things are going to be huge. Well, they're huge right now, and everybody knows that, so I'm stating the obvious. But as part of those plans into the future, trying to make sure that you're figuring those things out. And I know a huge problem that everyone is facing is how do we make sure that students are getting equal educational opportunities? Maybe we have a really good, or we had a really good virtual type system already set up, but now we're finding that we have a bunch of our population of students in these areas that have no access to broadband, to data, and those types of things. So even though you might have been well set up to actually give the instruction virtually and get everything back, you still have those pockets and those groups that now you're giving yourself, I don't want to say giving yourself, but now you have another problem that came up from really good intentions. So as far as length of time, I don't have a good answer. Paying attention to a lot of what I would call reputable studies as the data comes in, there are game changers to this. If we're lucky and all of a sudden a vaccine is developed, you can be for or against opening up in different types of phases, and not going to get into that right now. But once you get it there, all the experts say between 60 and 70% of the population exposed, then it's really not such an issue. But you did bring up a good point, Tom, and not trying to get away from your question. I'll come back to it. But what if in the fall, our state decides, okay, we're open back up, everything's just like it was before we shut down, but there has been an increase in spread and there has been an increase in spikes due to opening back up, and you have all these parents that are frightened to send their kids to school. That's a whole nother issue that I don't want to say no one's talking about, but it's back into that realm of possibilities, and that's what makes all of this so challenging. And that's why I said trying to communicate with your other, your other superintendents, groups as a whole, and trying to come up with some different game plans that you can modify. And I don't want to say this is a one and done. Maybe we'll never have a pandemic like this again. But if we can position ourselves so that we have some way of providing some form of education to our students, this could be, those plans, even though it might be for a pandemic as we're in now, could be used for a natural disaster. So a tornado comes through, or something happens to the power grid that all of a sudden, it's not months, years, or anything like that, but it's a long enough period that you have to implement something else. You can modify those plans. But back to your question, there are so many studies that are out there that are really good right now, but there's not enough data that's at least been published or backed up yet for anybody to really give a good idea on what it looks like. Los Alamos National Scientific Institute released a really good study 2 days ago, I believe, that's got some interesting stuff in it as far as length of time and the fact that the strain may be different than what it was originally out there. That also may indicate why some areas have more deaths, because it could be a different strain. They were comparing San Francisco with New York City because they're both densely populated, but the death toll is much different. Because there's none of that information yet, it's really hard to do that. And then there was another good one yesterday that came out that researchers, experts in their field, put out basically what they're calling 3 different possible models with how this is going to go. They're hoping for one that basically kind of just stays slow with the spread, but they're saying it's going to look more like fall's going to be a heavy hit with a heavy spread. But if they compare it to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, it's more of that up and down with spikes and decreases. Yeah, right. But they said they don't think it's that way because this virus seems to spread more than the Spanish flu. So like I said, as we're all waiting for data, you know, whether that's local government, trying to figure out how we're opening up, how are we providing services, how are we dealing with the public, schools, how are you providing services, how are we providing education, how are we getting those students that needs met, and then, you know, our staff and everyone else, we're all behind the 8 ball with not only trying to come up with all these different plans and trying to figure out things that we don't know, but we're also waiting on what I would call hard data that would help to guide us with those. Because if we had some of those and we had some, I don't want to call them absolutes, but at least good guesses, good data behind it that would show us, you know, this is probably what we're looking at. That would also help the government with deciding, you know, can we open up, and can we open up regionally? Can we open up statewide? Can we open up here and there? Can we then ratchet it back? And that was one thing that I was going to come back to. All superintendents, myself and my job, business leaders, everyone else, I think that's another thing everybody needs to be prepared for. Maybe we do go full Monty and we're back at school like we had before, maybe with some new normal and some social distancing of some sort and things like that. But as we all know, schools aren't set up for 6 feet of distance between everybody and, you know, all these different things. But what if then you get that spike and we are right back to where we are today with doing what we're doing? So that's why it's one of those that it's really important with communication with every partner that you have, and trying to see that if you can get different ideas from those partners that may work for you. And it may be outside of education. I know there's been lots of times that we've taken things from my job and my profession and applied it a little bit to the schools, and vice versa. I've used some things from what I've learned on the boards and learned from, you know, different school districts and things like that we've applied, you know, at my profession. So it's back to maybe you can grab snippets, maybe you can grab a little different things that will help you out. And then don't hold it all in. Share that information, communicate that information, have those conversations.
Well, the idea is it's a novel virus. That's why we don't have the studies, right? So we're grasping, but if we have a lot of people talking about a lot of things that they're noticing amongst interagencies, within agencies, doing those kind of things, that's going to be, I agree, incredibly important. One thing Wightman is doing is they're kind of scrapping their quarterly newsletter, the glossy, which shows the great work they're doing. But now we're saying we're going to do a weekly newsletter and just throw some things out there of the moment to communicate these things. And I think that's going to be happening and replicated across the state with different groups, different professionals. And I could see possibly having a video conference between public school and, you know, safety directors, and, you know, partnering together in the future, taking some of these things straight on and working together, because, you know, it is so tight of a situation when you talk about public safety and when you talk about schools. They're linked, incredibly tightly linked together for the safety of the kids, to make sure kids grow up to be full citizens of the United States, and learning how democracy works and all of those things that we all kind of still care about and still want to propose, but it's going to be different. Next fall will not be the same. There's going to be the differences, and why not talk together and try to share all that together in the best way we can. So as we move on this whole discussion, and you know, we're talking about 1 year out, 2 year out, 3 year out, what can we do now? But we also have buildings that aren't being occupied very much, and we have plumbing that can still leak, right? When you have all the students there and all your employees there, they notice things. So what do we do now as far as making sure that nobody's spray painting graffiti on the side of the walls when nobody's around the schools as much, especially maybe more of the rural schools that are out in the country a little bit? And what do we do when, you know, there's break-ins, and how do we keep kind of ourselves aware of what's going on at the buildings, as we don't use the buildings as much as we used to, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I think part of that is, you know, and you brought it up, we've been fortunate here that we've had a fantastic relationship back and forth with the schools before it was heard of. And, you know, a lot of times I would go to different things with the superintendent when I was a school resource officer, and people would look at, I think it was Rob Olson at that time. It might even have been Skip, but what is this guy doing there? You know, I'm in a uniform or whatever. And what are you talking about? This is about emergency planning. Well, yeah, for schools. But we've always been blessed. So one of the things that oftentimes, whether it's been talking about active shooter at different conferences, or, you know, talking about different things with the schools and law enforcement, schools and fire, that type of thing, is it's never too late to reach out, but you need to have a really good communication and do your best to have a good working relationship with the two entities. If you have that, with your question, you know, I don't say it's simple, but it's one of those you can come back and say, look, I know you guys are busy. I know you've got this going on, but this building, especially because of either where it's located, it's maybe a little more remote, that type of thing. Can you throw in some extra patrols? You know, are you aware of any of the neighbors that seem really good that, you know, maybe we don't have a neighborhood watch in that area, but, you know, somebody that's keeping an eye on it. You still have some room in the executive order, and this is my opinion, so it's not legal, that talks about planning and that sort of thing for schools. So I think you can still get some personnel in there to make sure that they're being checked on for the inside water leaks and that type of thing. But, you know, another concern too that's coming up is, depending on what happens with the executive orders, depending on what happens with social distancing guidelines, depending on what happens with all those things, as I said earlier, we have to live in today's executive order. So under those things, we have to try to make sure that we're not accidentally creating hot spots that we're, I don't want to say encouraging, because that wouldn't be the goal, but it might be an outcome. You know, a lot of places are trying to hurry and set up wireless hotspots so that, you know, kids have access. We want kids to have access. Problem is, if it's in a really nice place, maybe a park or things like that, or maybe a place with a lot of basketball hoops and tennis courts, and all of a sudden we're actually encouraging them to congregate, and then we're violating some of our executive orders, and we're not meaning to do that. So there has to be some of that thought process when we're doing it also, because like I said, that wasn't the goal, but suddenly now it's our outcome. So it's not easy, it's tough, it's gonna be a tough road to hoe, but it's just something we're gonna have to do.
You know, one of the big things that people are chatting about in the chat boxes and have made comments on is just the whole equity issue. Yeah. And the fact that, you know, this is my experience, and I'm a superintendent at Walkerville Public Schools, and we have a one-to-one. Every single student has a Chromebook right now, but the connectivity is about 60%. Neighboring districts are not much better, not much worse. So I like to say it's kind of like having a Ferrari, but you don't have any gas. Mm-hmm. So what real good does that do? Well, it does a lot of good for maybe the 60%. I guess, speaking as a superintendent, I really believe that that's probably one of the biggest issues for next year. And as you suggest, from the Los Alamos study and other studies, we may not have this all behind us in the fall. In fact, if we could be guaranteed it'd be all behind us in the fall, I think we'd all be very relieved, wouldn't we? It used to be, let's wait a month and it'll all be over. Let's wait 2 months. Let's wait till the end of summer. I think if everybody right now, superintendents and anybody, were to hear the word this is all over in September, we would all be thrilled. I believe anyways. So that's probably not going to happen. And what's your personal perspective as a father of 4, as a past school board member, as the public service safety director? What's your view on the whole accessibility issue and the equitability issue for students?
Well, to be honest, that's probably going to be outside of my range of expertise. What I will tell you, though, is between my ISD superintendent, who's doing a phenomenal job, the superintendents outside of there that I'm not on a board, but I personally know, you know, obviously the budget is a huge issue, but everyone across the board that I've talked to, you know, back to equitable. How are we doing this? How are we getting that to them? And that's where I'm saying that I think that's outside of my area of expertise to give any kind of solution. But it does go back to when I put it into my profession, when we run into those situations where how are we going to fix this, or how are we going to address this? We either work together internally, or we grab those people that we work with in our outside groups, or maybe it's, like I said, the group that I work with trying to develop best practices to be shared with other agencies. Throw it out there. I'm sure there's a listserv for superintendents, just like there is one for me with chiefs of police. The COVID stuff that we've been sharing is just, I don't want to say that there wasn't a lot of usage on that, because there always has been, but before we always wanted to make sure that because of the volume that we would reply just to the person asking those questions, unless somebody else chimed in and said, hey, I'd like that too. Well, now with the COVID thing, most of them, we're just letting them go because all of us want that information and we're interested in what other areas are doing. And can we apply that to us? Are we already doing that? Or is that something that we could use? Or if we can, how can we implement it? And I think you all are very, very intelligent, and hence you're superintendents, you know. But it's just one of those things that the communication piece and trying to figure it out and not probably relying on somebody. The one thing that I do know is, out of all the conferences I've been to, conferences I've spoken at, the one thing that I've learned is the first person that ever got up and if they talked and they either said, A, they knew everything, or whatever they were going to tell me was going to fix whatever issue they were addressing, I knew they were full of it, because there's multiple. But I think it's back to the question earlier, you know, working with each other, communicating, having those conversations, trying to plan out. And as you're doing that, maybe you get stuck. Involve community members, involve your staff. You know, you're going to have shareholders in this when this all comes back, and buy-in in the fall, whatever it's going to look like. There may be pushback. Granted, hopefully it won't be directed at local superintendents if it's the state's decision, but you know, there may be that pushback. So if you're involving them in some parts of that planning process, and even if it is part of that development, so maybe you do have that group that's isolated, that you're talking about usage with your Chromebooks. Maybe you can grab some of those as part of your planning out strategies and bring some of those parents in, virtually, of course, and have those conversations with, look, I know you're trying, I know you're frustrated, I know you're not a teacher, I know you're now understanding why you're getting all these reports of your kid being terrible at school. No, I'm kidding. But, you know, but we know it's a problem, and, you know, we're trying to get you some solutions, and we're trying to help you with some of these things. Do you have some suggestions? Do you have any input? At least then, even if they don't, they know that you're working on it. And, you know, it's one of those things, it's back to that transparency, being open, and back to communication.
Well, you know, perfect. And totally agree with that as a superintendent. We're kind of winding down a little bit, but one thing I'd like to have everybody consider who's on this call is, if you possibly can, to stay after the 1:45 and maybe talk about what you're doing yourselves to help the equity issue. Because if we can learn from each other, then more students are presented more opportunities, as you just suggested, Geoff, and we're getting more done for education. So hopefully several of you will be able to stay on the show after we officially are done with this at 1:45. It would be, I think, a rich conversation to help us continue on and help students. It's getting down to the point where you might want to say a few things that you may have missed, or I may have missed, as far as asking questions, Geoff. Do you have some things that you wanted to make sure that we all knew about before the question and answer?
I think I got through most of the big points of things that we discussed ahead of time. If I just highlight a couple, one of the things that I'll point out too is we can have some discussion afterwards if we want to get specific about my COVID journey and my family. I'm happy to do that afterwards too. Communication's key. You all are in a very tough situation right now, and we all are on different levels. But between budgeting and trying to figure out the budget, I know that it's going to be an issue too, because even though you might have the grandest plan and, hey, we can build this out, what's it going to cost and where are those funds coming from? You've got all these curveballs coming from all over the place. But if I can highlight two main things that I would suggest that I use, that we use all the time on trying to work through, I don't call them disasters, but problems, significant events and things like that. Communication and planning. And like I said, sometimes we may have to grab a plan that was for something else, so we're not reinventing the wheel, grabbing that and then tweaking it and then expanding it. And then those plans have got to change. That's the other thing, that a lot of times people get focused in that this is the plan, this is how it goes. Well, if it's not effective or there's been changes, that plan needs to be fluid and dynamic. So, things like that. So I think that's all I've got for a recap, unless I missed something.
I think you've said a lot.
Geoff, Tom, thank you so much for moderating and being our guest today. I just wanted to take this opportunity, and it looks like my screen went haywire on me, just to kind of wrap up real quick, and then we're going to open the mics up for Q&A. You heard Geoff and Tom discuss planning. As a professional firm that does a lot of planning, not only internally, but for our clients, we understand the value of that, and you can never plan for everything. And right now, we're in that triage phase where we have to make decisions, we have to prioritize things quickly in order to move things forward. And then, secondly, in terms of continuity between learning and operations, and really focusing on the learners, the inequity of access to the internet and the ability to be able to learn by distance learning, there's got to be a solution to that. And as you guys were talking about that, I'm just wondering if one of these stimulus packages that they can run, connectivity to each house, limit it to only school use, and make that some type of a mandate that has to happen so that we eliminate that equity curve. I mean, Tom, you have that one-to-one in your community, fantastic. But like you said, if only 60% of the students are getting the full, power out of that, out of having that equipment,
Right.
What are we doing with the other 40? And there's got to be a way. I mean, we're a rich enough country, and we're innovative enough that we should be able to figure that out. So anyways, I want to thank you for participating, and we're going to open it up for Q&A, but I just want to remind everybody that the next town hall will be on May 20th at 1 o'clock. So that's 2020. And if you have any other questions or suggestions, please go ahead and email us at info@gowightman.com.
What do you think, Christine?
I don't see any hands.
Okay.
Have any questions? Feel free to speak up.
This part was kind of an add-on for what we were going to do originally. So obviously we answered a lot of the questions, and if we're not seeing any questions, I just wish all of you a successful rest of the school year and your COLs go well. And we will look forward to you seeing us on May 20th.
Yes, thank you everybody for participating.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Geoff, for being our guest. All right, goodbye, everybody.